She signed her name to the marriage line with a hand she willed not to shake. And the man across the clerk's table signed his beneath it without a word. And just like that, Rosa Danforth was somebody's wife and safe, for the first time in a year, from the men who had been closing on her like wolves on a lamed horse. She had answered his notice in the territorial paper 3 weeks back. A homesteader at Ash Fork wants a wife, honest and willing, no money asked, no questions put. And she had told him in her return letter only that she was honest and willing and needed to be gone from where she was. And he had sent the fare and a single line back in a plain square hand. Come. I ask nothing you don't offer. And here he stood, having asked nothing, a big silent man in a clean worn shirt. And here she was, married to a stranger, to keep from being dragged back to answer for a dead man's debts that were never hers. Her husband, Cormac Beale, the paper had said, and she tried the name over silently and found it strange in her mind, settled her small trunk in the wagon bed as though it weighed nothing, and handed her up onto the seat with a courtesy that did not quite meet her eyes. He did not speak on the long drive out. Rosa sat with her hands folded hard in her lap and watched the town fall behind and the sage country open out. And she waited, the way a woman learns to wait, for the price of all this to show itself. There was always a price. Her father had taught her that with his debts and his charm, her father's creditors had taught it to her with their soft threats and their softer smiles. A man did not send fare to a woman he'd never met, and marry her sight unseen, and ask, truly, for nothing. She had decided on the train that whatever he wanted she would bear it if she must, because the thing behind her was worse. She had made herself hard for it. The homestead at Ash Fork was a plain, snug cabin under a cottonwood, a good barn, a garden gone a little wild for want of a woman's hands. He carried her trunk in and set it down in a small room off the main one, a room with a bed made up fresh, a room with a bolt on the inside of the door. "This is yours," Cormac Beale said. They were near the first words he'd spoken to her. He nodded at the bolt. "It draws from your side. I put it on myself." He looked, for a moment, almost as uncertain as she felt. "I'll sleep out by the stove. You needn't fear me. I'll not come near that door." Rosa stood in the little room and did not understand him at all. "You married me," she said, carefully, testing. "I did." "Men who marry generally," she stopped, her face going hot. "I know what they generally." He turned his hat in his big scarred hands. "I didn't send for a servant, nor for—" He seemed to search for a decent word and not find one, and set the whole thought down. "I sent for a wife because a place like this is a hard, lonesome thing to work alone, and because a woman wrote me back that she needed to be gone from somewhere, and I know something about needing to be gone from somewhere. That's all I know of you, and all I'll ask, till you care to tell it. You've your own room and your own bolt. What this is, past that, will let be what you make it, and no faster." He put his hat on. "There's eggs to gather if you're of a mind. If you're not, there's still supper. Rest yourself." And he went out, and Rosa Danforth stood a long time in the little room with the bolt she did not need, and something in her chest, that had been clenched tight for a year, gave one slow, painful throb, like a limb waking up. She kept the bolt drawn the first week out of long habit. She stopped hearing herself draw it the second. By the third, she had noticed that Cormac Beale was, in every particular, a man of his word. He did not come near her door, did not touch her hand longer than a hand up onto the wagon required, did not once let his eyes rest on her in the way she had spent a year learning to dread. He rose before her and had the fire going. He left the choicest of everything on her side of the table and ate the rest without remark. When a spring rain caught her at the wash line, he came in from the field to help her gather it in and said not one word about it after, as though a man helping his wife were the plainest thing in the world and not worth the mentioning. He was the most silent man she had ever known, and she came to understand, slowly, that the silence was not coldness. It was a kind of grief, worn smooth. She learned in scraps, from a chipped second cup he never used, from a child's small carved horse she found on a shelf and set back exactly as it lay, that there had been a wife before, and a little one, and that the fever that swept Ash Fork 4 years gone had taken them both, and that Cormac Beale had gone quiet, the way some men go quiet after a thing like that, the whole of his heart driven so far down that only his hands could still speak for him. And speak they did, in the shelf he mended without being asked, in the wildflowers she found once, awkward in a tin cup on the table, put there by a man who could not have said the word for what he meant if his life hung on it. Rosa began, without deciding to keep the choicest bits back for him in her turn. She mended his shirts fine. She learned he favored his coffee near to boiling, and made it so. She caught herself listening for the particular sound of his step, and one evening she looked up from the mending to find the cabin warm and the bread rising, and the silent man reading his one book by the fire, and she realized with a small shock that she was not afraid, had not been afraid in some while, that the hardness she had made of herself for the journey had gone somewhere without her marking its leaving. There came a hard stretch in early summer that bound them closer than any words might have. A wall of hail came down off the mountains without warning one afternoon, white and roaring, and it caught the young calves out on the flat and set the whole homestead to a scramble. Rosa did not stop to think whether it was a wife's place or a servant's or none at all. She caught up her skirts and went out into it beside him, and the two of them drove the balling stock into the lee of the barn, through ice that struck like flung gravel, working without a word because none was needed, each somehow knowing where the other would be. When it was done, they stood together in the barn's dim shelter, both of them soaked and bruised and gasping, the hail drumming the shakes overhead, and Cormac looked at her, at the mud on her hem, and the welt rising on her wrist, and the fierce set of her jaw, and something moved in his still face that she had not seen there before, a kind of wondering. "You didn't have to come out in that," he said. "They were your calves. A body doesn't stand at a window and watch a year's work beaten into the ground for the sake of a dry hem. They were." A pause, the hail loud between them. "They're yours, too. It's your place, Rosa. I keep forgetting you don't know it yet." She did not know what to say to that, so she said nothing, and he said nothing, and they stood in the companionable ruin of the afternoon, watching the ice melt to nothing in the yard. And it was, she thought later, the first hour of her marriage. She had felt herself to be not a fugitive sheltering under a stranger's roof, but a woman standing in her own barn beside her own man. That night her wrist ached, and she found, when she went to bandage it, that he had already set out the salve and a strip of clean linen on the table where she would find them, and gone to his bed by the stove without a word, as was his way. She told him, one night, the whole of it. She had not meant to. But he had asked her, in his sparing way, whether the men she'd fled were like to trouble her here, and she found the story coming out of her in the dark by the stove, her father's debts and his dying, the notes that came due with her name forged beneath his, the creditors who had let it be known that a young woman with no money might settle a young woman's way, the closing in, the terror of it, the notice in the paper like a hand reached down into a well. She told it plain and dry-eyed, and waited for the thing to change in his face, for the price to show at last. Cormac Beale was quiet a long moment when she'd done. Then he said, low, "No man is coming into this house after you. I want you easy on that." And that was all. And it was enough. And Rosa put her face in her hands and let go, finally, of a year of holding on. And the silent man did not touch her, only sat near in the firelight and let her weep herself empty, which was, she understood later, exactly the kindness she could bear and no other. The price she'd waited on all that while showed itself at last, but it was not his. It came up the Ash Fork Road on a hot afternoon in the shape of 2 men on livery horses, town clothes and hard faces, a paper in a saddlebag, and the law bent to their purpose. Rosa saw them from the garden and knew them before they were halfway up the track, and the old cold terror came down on her so fast her knees near buckled. Rell and Sackett, her father's men, come the long way after all. Cormac came up from the barn unhurried, wiping his hands on a rag, and put himself between his wife and the 2 riders without seeming to do anything so pointed as that. He said, "Help you?" The heavier man, Sackett, smiled his soft smile. We've business with the woman. There's a matter of debt in the territory she came from, and a bond, and some question whether a marriage got up in a hurry can stand against a lawful claim that come first. We've a paper." He nudged his horse a step nearer. "It'd go easier if she came along quiet and let the court sort. She's my wife." Cormac did not raise his voice. He had a way of going very still that Rosa had seen once, when a rattler crossed the yard. A stillness, with the whole of a hard, capable man gathered behind it. Married lawful, signed and filed, before any court in this territory. You've a paper, I've a paper too, and mine's got her name and mine on it, and a clerk's seal, and it says plain that whatever she was, she's mine to answer for now. You want to test which paper stands? You do it through the marshal at the county seat, in the daylight, with a judge looking on, not by hauling my wife off a livery horse while her husband stands here telling you no." The two men looked at him. They looked at the rifle that had appeared, not pointed at anything, simply come to rest in the crook of his arm, the way a tool comes to a workman's hand. They looked at the plain, unbudging fact of him standing there, between them and the woman, a man with nothing left to lose, that he feared losing worse than this. "There's easier money than this," the thinner man, Rel, said finally, to his partner, low. Sackett's soft smile had gone thin. A forged note was one thing to press against a friendless girl. It was another thing entirely to carry into a county court against a married homesteader, and his deed, and his seal, and his willingness to make them prove every crooked word of it under oath. They had come expecting a lamb. They had found a wall. Sackett gathered his reins. "Enjoy your wife," he said, ugly, and reined around, and the two of them went back down the Ash Fork Road in the hot dust, and did not come again. Rosa stood shaking in the garden. Cormac set the rifle against the fence and came to her, and for the first time in the months of their marriage, he lifted his hand and, slow, giving her every instant to draw back, laid it against her cheek. She did not draw back. She turned her face into his rough palm. "You didn't have to do that," she whispered. "You didn't sign on for their kind of trouble. You could have handed me over and been clear of it." "No," Cormac Beale said. "I could not have." And there was such a plain finality in it, such a quiet astonishment that she could have imagined otherwise, that Rosa understood at last that this silent man had given her, without a word and without a price, the one thing she had stopped believing was in the world to be had, a place to stand that no one could pull out from under her. "I bolted that door a month for nothing," she said, half a laugh, half a sob. "You bolted it because you'd earned the right to. I'd not have taken that from you for anything." His thumb moved once along her cheekbone. "Draw it or leave it, Rosa. It's yours either way. I'd not mind, one day, if you left it drawn back. That's all. No faster than you like." She left it drawn back that night, and it stayed so, and the little room off the main one went in time from a fortress to a nursery, though that was later. What came first was only this: a hard, silent man and a woman who had married him to run from her life, sitting together in the firelight of the cabin at Ash Fork, learning each other slow, the bolt undrawn, the road empty, the whole of the frontier dark held off by one warm room, and the plain and steady fact of a man who had asked her for nothing and given her everything, and gone on giving it, quiet, for all the long good years that followed.